let's take a look at Module 4, which deals specifically with enumeration. And at first glance, this seems an awful lot like scanning, but it's definitely its own distinct phase. It is part of the scanning step or scanning phase in the hacking lifecycle. It is definitely a pre-attack type of activity, but it has a tendency to be a bit more intrusive, and you're accessing information actually residing on the host versus externally observable information like open ports, OS versions, etc. All right, so first off, the definition. Riddle me this. What is enumeration? Enumeration is listing the details of blank. Whatever context you use the term in, you're listing specifics. So in this case, we might enumerate network resources, network shares, routing tables, audit and service settings, SNMP and FQDN details, machine names, users and groups. Again, at this stage of the game, we're really interested in user accounts because they already have access, and applications and banners. So we have NetBIOS enumeration, LDAP enumeration, SMTP enumeration, RPC enumeration, NFS enumeration, SMB enumeration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the definition lists creating an active connection with the target system and performing directed queries to gain more information about a target. So at this stage, you're actually interacting or establishing a connection to a degree to the system where we weren't necessarily doing that in the scanning module. Attackers will use the extracted information, identify points for a system attack, and potentially perform password attacks, which we're going to be talking about in the system hacking module. Now, the statement that enumeration techniques are conducted in an internet environment is not 100% hard and fast rule. There is enumeration that takes place externally, specifically public DNS zone enumeration. But most of the interesting stuff we'll be talking about in this module is inside the security perimeter. All right, techniques for enumeration. You have extracting usernames using email IDs. Now, your username and password combination should be difficult to guess, easy to remember, the kind of standard password rules, but there should be a secrecy factor with your username or your account ID as much as there should be a secrecy factor with the password itself. Usernames need to be unique. So for convenience, most people choose their email address because it's guaranteed to be unique globally. But in reality, anybody that has your email address has 1/2 of a credential set for at least one account that you've created somewhere. So it's a good idea to use something unique. Email IDs are quite often used. I myself am definitely guilty of that. But anybody that's compromised that email ID or found stolen credentials on the dark web, what they have been pwned database, etc., you can pretty much guarantee that those usernames and passwords are used at least on one more site somewhere. All right, extracting information using default passwords. Default passwords are just like they sound. They're the defaults. They haven't been modified. There are websites that are dedicated to the cataloging of default passwords. Just do a Google search, default passwords. You'll find several sites that list databases of default passwords and different levels of access. So the passwords we're going to talk more about in the system hacking module, so we're going to swing back to that in module 6. Brute forcing Active Directory. Brute forcing Active Directory in all likelihood will get you locked out after X number of invalid authentication attempts. Account lockouts are a great countermeasure to prevent brute force or dictionary attacks against authentication mechanisms. So in all likelihood, you're going to get locked out unless you can compromise an administrator account. Those by default in Windows environments can't be locked out. So we'll talk more about that. We talk about password cracking, brute force attacks, and I'll show you some examples of that in later modules. Extracting information using the DNS zone transfer. We mentioned this in Footprint and Recon, and we mentioned it briefly in the scanning module, but a DNS zone transfer is a nice bit of information if the server allows it. Mostly, DNS zone transfers get shut down because DNS Best Practices 101 states that you do not allow zone transfers to untrusted hosts. Best practices are not always followed. There are lots of DNS servers out there that are reachable that will allow zone transfers. Now we can use those later on in various types of denial of service attacks as well. But if you request a zone transfer and you get it, you had to say that was a good day, since it's a list of host names and IP addresses for the entire zone. Now there's also internal and external DNS zones. We'll talk more about that later in this module. There should be a separation between public and private DNS zone files. No commingling of accounts between the two. All right, extracting user groups from Windows. Let's go with users. The group memberships they belong to will definitely affect the privilege that we have, but you can't log in with the group. So we are first and foremost interested in user accounts and extracting usernames using SNMP. That can also be useful, again, for usernames, but it is a myth that you pull passwords from an SNMP database. And I'll talk more about that when we get to SNMP. The usernames, yes. The password hashes, no. Services and ports to enumerate. All right, TCP and UDP, port 53. TCP is for DNS zone transfers. UDP is for DNS queries. The zone transfers, again, are requests to transfer the entire zone file from an authoritative server. Those should be shut down as a best practice to unknown servers, but every so often, again, you get lucky. TCP, UDP 135, UDP 137, TCP 139. There's also 138 in there for the datagram service. These are all NetBIOS ports, and these scream Microsoft Box, Microsoft Box. However, it may be a Linux Samba server or Samba client, or it may be a network printer servicing NetBIOS printing requests. TCP 139 is server message block protocol over NetBIOS. TCP UDP 445 is SMB over straight TCP. NetBIOS has not been required since Windows 2000 came out in the year 2000. Here we are 22 plus years later, and NetBIOS is still enabled by default on the default installation of a Windows operating system. It is recommended you shut it off if it's not needed, but there are a lot of legacy applications historically that use NetBIOS name resolution. So there's a lot of net commands that don't necessarily require NetBIOS, they're SMB specific, but a lot of useful net commands for footprinting and extracting information from a target system, and very useful also in forensics. So TCP UDP 445, server message block protocol over straight TCP IP. UDP 161, yes please. We love SNMP, since SNMP is usually of the insecure variety, pre-version 3. It uses clear text community strings. Well, heck, we're going to do a whole slide and work up on it here in a few minutes. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So I'm going to hold off on the full discussion. But we generally get a little bit excited when we see a UDP 161, because invariably we're going to pull something useful from the box. TCP UDP 389. 389 and 636 are Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or LDAP. LDAP by default runs on port 389. This screams Microsoft Domain Controller, since it's Directory Service Interactive Protocol, which implies you've got an X.500 database or Directory Services database. You'll typically see a port 88 to go with that, maybe a 3389 global catalog server. So that kind of screams I'm a Microsoft Domain Controller. Now later on, we're going to talk about clear text versus encrypted. 636 is LDAP-S, which is LDAP over an SSL or TLS connection. TCP 2049, that is Network File System, which is the Linux version of Server Message Block Protocol, basically. Taking a few liberties with that definition, but for comparative analysis, it's roughly the same purpose. TCP 25, that is Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. It's used for sending emails. Also clear text by default. We'll swing back to the clear text versus encrypted in our sniffers module. TCP UDP 162, SNMP trap. That's used to send notifications when certain thresholds are reached. They're more or less alerts. Those will indicate an SNMP-enabled host, but we don't typically do much with the trap port. UDP 500 is the Internet Security and Key Management Protocol, or Internet Key Exchange. This facilitates the establishment of an IPsec connection primarily. We'll talk more about that when we get into session hijacking. We'll talk more about that when we start talking about different types of transport encryption and tunnel mode encryption. All right, TCP/22, Secure Shell. This is the encrypted alternative to what are otherwise clear text administration protocols like Telnet and the old Berkeley R-Login. This generally implies it's some kind of box, but not Windows. Windows by default doesn't use the SSH protocol. All right, now that's a short list, but those are some of the usual suspects and some of the notable services we're trying to identify. And most of this will be, again, inside the security perimeter. There's not a lot of great reason to expose server message block protocol or SNMP to the outside world through the firewall if there's not a valid business case or reason for it. So this stuff should not be accessible as a general rule from outside the perimeter. All right, NetBIOS enumeration. So think back to the Earth had just cooled, and then the dinosaurs came. And then the proprietary protocols started emerging, right? So you have Apple with AppleTalk, you have IPX, SPX with Novell NetWare, you have Banyan Vines, you got DEC Alpha, you got TCP/IP as a standard, routable standard. Microsoft's got NetBEUI. And one by one, all of those proprietary protocols get dropped in favor of the standard routable TCP/IP. So Microsoft holds on a little bit longer, and they actually run their NetBIOS protocol over straight IP. So originally NetBIOS the NetBIOS name is a unique 16 ASCII character string, 15 characters for device name, and a 16th character reserved for the service name or the record type. So that indicates things like host name, domain name, messenger service, etc. This is a user-friendly name, just like an FQDN, and it gets resolved to an address. And originally, it got resolved directly to a MAC address. Okay? Then when NetBEUI was no longer effective or useful in routed environments, since it's not routable, we start resolving the NetBIOS name to the IP address, which then eventually resolves to the MAC address through address resolution protocol. So Microsoft holds on longer, NetBIOS over TCP/IP. NetBIOS utilities are useful for gathering information about a target host. They're also useful for system administration. They're also useful, again, for forensics, and I mentioned that in the previous slide. Attackers can use NetBIOS enumeration to get a list of computers that belong to the domain, a list of shares on the individual hosts in the network, policies and passwords, etc., etc. All right, so a couple examples. NBTstat is a command line utility for NetBIOS over TCP/IP statistics. So if I was to open a command line in NBTstat TAC capital A 10.0.0.19, I get the NetBIOS name table of my server 2019 machine and its MAC address. So this would indicate the machine name, the work group that it belongs to, and then some services running on the box and the MAC address. Nothing to stop me from getting that. Now, before we go much further in this module, I'm going to blast an Nmap scan, and we're going to see once again that Nmap is really useful. So I'm going to run a intense scan plus UDP against my victim machine. And we're going to see that Nmap does most of this for us within the scan. Pretty cool. So if Nmap does it for free, why do we need all these other tools? Exactly, that's my point. So one of the tools you're going to focus on first to get comfortable and proficient with is definitely going to be Nmap. All right, so that's an NBTstat. The NBTstat-C for this discussion is not really that notable. This is the NetBIOS name cache. The name cache is for any NetBIOS names that have been resolved within the last 10 minutes or 600 seconds. This could be used to identify nearby machines, and we use it in forensic investigations as well to identify any machines that have been recently connected to or from in an incident response or intrusion investigation. All right, an attacker could use that to find other systems nearby if they've already compromised the box. All right, additional NetBIOS enumeration tools. There's lots of Windows-based GUIs, and the course has plenty of options to play around with Windows-based GUIs. But again, at the end of the day, if Nmap does it in one interface, not a lot of reason to use anything else. So they help to understand the concepts, and they're GUIs, so they're graphically, visually stimulating, and they're easy to conceptualize and visualize. But once you learn the concepts, I definitely recommend you switch over to scripts or command line. There's a lot of power in scripts and command line, and they can also be tuned for very specific types of information. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the course. All right, Nmap. Nmap has an NBStat Nmap scripting engine, which we're going to see it actually runs that as part of my Intense Scan plus UDP. It throws it in and basically throws the whole kitchen sink at that box and comes back with a variety of scripts executed and information extracted. But if I want to run that individually, and it's missing the T, which always confuses me, NBStat. There we go. So again, most of this stuff can be done with Nmap. All right, enumerating user accounts, and I'm going to let that Server 2019 scan cook for a bit, and we'll swing on back and see, wow, everything we've talked about in this module got accomplished in that Nmap scan. So maybe I'll just focus on using Nmap, and it's free. Best return on your investment for your security dollar. All right, enumerating user accounts, the PS tools, monster powerful, no argument there. Only 2 of these commands actually will enumerate user accounts though, but the PS tools suite is part of the sysinternals tool suite, which is one of the most useful tool bundles ever. And congratulations, Mark Russinovich, on, I think, 25-year anniversary of the sysinternals, previously known as Winternals tool suite. Monstrously powerful and useful utilities, and anything by Mark Russinovich is a fantastic piece of software. So again, congratulations, Mark. If you happen to be ever hearing this lecture, this demonstration, love your tools, been using them forever. The PS Get SID and PS Logged On will actually enumerate local user accounts. PS Get SID displays the SID of a computer user. PS Logged On will show who's logged on locally and via resource sharing. Now, we love this one in forensics investigations because it shows who's currently connected to the box. The PS Get SID, we're going to use that to illustrate what a SID looks like, because that's an important concept to understand in Windows environments. But I do want to briefly touch on the other tools. PS Exec executes processes remotely, excellent. PS File shows files open remotely, excellent. PS Kill kills processes by name or process ID, excellent. PS Info lists information about a system. Log list dumps event log records, change passwords, shut down the box, list information about running processes. These are usually an alternative to a native Windows system utility on steroids. So really, really good stuff and totally free. So love the sysinternals tools. Hail to the mighty Mark Russinovich. All right, PS Get SID, let's take a look at that. I'm going to actually hop over to my 2019 machine and do it from there. I do a command, pin that to my taskbar as well. All right, PS Get SID by itself will show me the SID for the local system. Now, actually, there's multiple security authorities on a given system. That's a discussion for another day. This number is considered to be machine specific. I'm actually zoom this out just a little bit. All right, so the S1521, that's static. These 3 strings of numbers are unique to the system, and then there's a relative identifier like 500 for administrator or 501 for guest. Then 1,000 and up are user accounts added after the installation of the operating system, but the relative identifier And the SID in general does not change when you rename an account. It never changes. So that's how the machine keeps track of security principles. The administrator account is recommended that you rename immediately or you leave it disabled because it can't be locked out by default. And if somebody guesses at the new name of the administrator account, they can brute force it. So we're not going to have the whole brute force discussion right now, but if I know there's an administrator account in the system, I can run an active online authentication attack and run through a word list or brute force and nothing to stop me from getting locked out. I can keep pounding away until I'm successful. I'm going to show you an example of that when we get to our web applications discussion, and I'll use an online password cracker to demonstrate the administrator account doesn't get locked out. All right, so that's PS get SID. And then PS logged on. All right, shows me logged on locally and logged on via resource shares. So that can help to identify user accounts. All right, so again, at this stage of the game, really interested in user accounts. They've already got access. All right, net commands. Now I'm going to show you, and this is one of the reasons I keep some legacy machines around. I'm going to show you the concept of the null user account and the null session, which is no longer a thing in Windows operating systems. They've been disabled entirely at this point, and they've been heavily restricted over the years. But I can bet that you're going to run across the null user concept somewhere in your studies and in your reading, and I'm going to show you what it looks like firsthand. So back in the days of Windows 2000, this was the holy grail of Windows hacking. There were situations where systems needed to talk to each other in the absence of a set of common shared credentials. So, for example, sharing LM host files for NetBIOS name resolution, for reading browse lists from the master browser. If I didn't have an active set of credentials on that system, then I shouldn't be able to access information on that box. So Microsoft comes up with the null user account. An account that, wait for it, has no name. No name and no password, literally blank. And you could use that for anonymous authentication. Initially, it was way too insecure. There was way too much you could do with it. So it got locked down pretty quickly through these restrict anonymous registry keys. And then eventually the null session was disabled altogether. But this is a great opportunity to show what the null session looks like and use a netview command as part of the demonstration. So on my 2019 machine, I'm going to do a netview whack victim, enter, and I should get access as denied. Ooh. Incompatible SMB type, fall back to 2012. Okay, I get access as denied. Or path is not found, not denied. Yeah, it's the SMB version. All right, so I'll use a mid-range machine. All right, access is denied. If I do a net use, whack victim, and spell it right, IPC $sign for inter-process communication share, double quote for blank password, /u : double quote for blank username, and hit enter, my command has been completed successfully. Now if I do a netview again, what I just got denied is now available. I can see the shares on the box. All right, well, big deal, just the shares on the box. Yeah, but I couldn't do that before without the establishment of the null session. So again, that null session dried up over different iterations of the operating system, and it's no longer around. But if you run into it in your studies, you're like, what's this thing about the null session? Oh, null user, there it is. All right, so netview can also be used to identify systems on the network. This may actually pick up my home network as well. 2019 is doing some weird stuff. Let me hit 2012 again. There we go. Some weird local subnet issues with this VMware setup. But there's the host on the box. You can also, on the network, you can also identify hosts that belong to domains and so forth. All right, so that's a little bit on NetBIOS. There's more utilities, most definitely, to talk about in the NetBIOS suite, but those are the ones we want to take a look at here in the enumeration module. All right, SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol, yes. Okay, older versions of SNMP, pre-version 3, have glaring security vulnerabilities. So I kind of like my whiteboard diagram on this, so we're going to flip right to it. All right, so this is how SNMP works. All right, you have an SNMP-enabled host. You can put a frowny face because the system's about to get victimized. You have a listener on UDP port 161, and you have a management information base. It's a horrible MIB. It's maintained on the box that contains a hierarchy of object identifiers. Object identifiers are big, long, ugly, dotted decimal notated strings. 1.0.6.8.4.12.9.10, et cetera, and I'm completely making that up as I go along, but that's what they look like. These OIDs map to specific pieces of information, like user accounts on the system, listening ports, process table, et cetera, et cetera. So when a manager queries the agent on port 161, it uses what are called community strings, which are clear text passwords. Public gives read access, and private gives read-write access. All right, so I can run a query. If I know the IP and the community string, I can request an OID, and it responds back with things like user accounts. So the insecurities. Number one, you're using the same password for everybody. A one-size-fits-all password is a horrible idea. It's also clear text, which my standard icon for clear text is a smiley face. That puts a smile on her face because even if it's changed from the default, I just sniff it off the wire. You can't trip any account lockouts because it's a one-size-fits-all password. You would cause a denial of service. So you can brute force it till you're successful. You can sniff it. You can try the default because a lot of times it's not changed. And you can also, once you gain access, see everything. There's no granularity of control. There's no access control list on the MIB. There's also no encrypted authentication, no granularity, nothing's encrypted, horrible. So logging into and transport encryption, that should all be encrypted, the logins and the actual data flow. Okay, SNMP version 3 addresses all of that, but it's not backwards compatible with legacy SNMP-enabled devices. So you just don't see a lot of it out there, even though it's been out for decades. So I can run an SNMP walk utility. There's tons of them. SNMP walk, Nmap has a script for it. And again, a ZenMap scan will include all that SNMP information. And then there's graphical browsers and a ton of other SNMP tools. So if I was to scroll on up through my Nmap scan, the second it finds UDP 161 open, it goes to work. It requests object identifiers like the MS TCP loopback interface configuration information, the AMC PCNet adapter, AMD PCNet adapter, the listening ports. There's a netstat. which, hold on a second, isn't that a port scan? It is, from inside the box. Would that be somewhat on the stealthy side? Oh yeah. All right, so full netstat, full enumeration of processes. Okay, processes indicate software running on the system. You could have a vulnerable process. Services, same thing. What services are running? Share information, installed software, and then the user accounts. Not a bad bit of information for a basic request. So again, Nmap does it as part of a script, which it automatically executed when it discovered the UDP-161 listener. Not bad. All right, so again, if Nmap can do it, why do I need any other tools? Exactly. All right, so that's a little bit on SNMP enumeration. We're also going to talk about SMTP enumeration, and now we're going to talk about LDAP enumeration. All right, LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is used to interact with distributed directory services. Okay, directory services were originally designed to distribute email, but Novell made them big back in the days of NetWare through their Novell directory services, and then Microsoft followed suit in 2000 and turned their Exchange 5.5 database into Active Directory. And we've been using it ever since. Directory services are organized hierarchically. We're not going to get too much into the structure of a directory service, but any LDAP enumeration utility can connect to the directory system agent on port 389, and once it's authenticated, depending on the security context and the access control list of the objects, you can read information out of the database. So attackers will query the LDAP service to gather information like valid usernames, addresses, departmental details, etc. So again, at this stage of the game, we are really interested in usernames. All right, additional LDAP enumeration tools, there's actually plenty of them. You can perform LDAP enumeration manually using like Python, automatically using scripts, graphically using things like Softerra LDAP Administrator, or really any Active Directory administration utility, LDAP search, etc., etc. Now in the lab, you're going to be using like LDAP Explorer, so there's plenty of LDAP tools out there, but it does require that you authenticate or bind to the database before you're going to see anything. All right, NTP enumeration, Network Time Protocol, keeps clocks synchronized. That sounds kind of boring and lame. At first glance, it is. Keeping clocks synced seems mundane and kind of boring, but if clocks aren't synced, you can wreak some serious havoc. Number one, if your system clock is more than 5 minutes out of sync with your domain controller, your Kerberos server, you can't log in. So you got a full denial of service happening there. Also, if I set the system clock askew on multiple hosts that are all being used in an attack, then when they forward to the log reporting engine, all the timestamps are off and you can't rebuild an accurate timeline. So it throws off event correlation in incident response. You can also set system clocks back to pre-expiration dates of certificates, things like that. So at first glance, it sounds kind of boring, but there's actually some pretty powerful usages of NTP exploitation. Now, as far as testing for it goes, the NTP server uses UDP port 123 as its primary means of communication. You can achieve time to within 10 milliseconds. Okay, fantastic, sounds pretty accurate. Accuracies of 200 microseconds or better in local area networks under ideal conditions. All right, fantastic. Those are the accuracy numbers on NTP. That's the port number it listens on. What can I do with an NTP server? Well, if you can compromise an NTP server, you might be able to get a list of the connected hosts, which helps you to identify, again, internal hosts. Client IP addresses in a network, their system names, NOSs, and internal IPs if the NTP server is in the demilitarized zone. So if you can get to it from the outside world and it's servicing internal clients, you got kind of a bank shot into the internal network to identify internal IPs. All right, there's a few different command line utilities around NTP. We don't really have a lab for it, and it's not really set up for a demonstration. But NTP Trace, NTPDC, and NTPQ are all part of the NTP suite. And the idea there is you can trace a chain of servers back to the source, monitor the operation of the daemon, monitor operations, and determine performance. And to be honest with you, I don't really do much with NTP on a regular basis. Network file system enumeration. So when we look at a Microsoft box and we list the shares, that's server message block protocol, common internet file system enumeration. We look at a Unix box or Linux box, it's network file system. So the NFS system, which again runs on port 2049, all right, allows you to enumerate directories, lists of clients connected to the NF server, with their IP addresses, share data with the IP addresses. Okay, commands like show mount and RPC info will identify listening RPC endpoints. With RPCs, we're gonna be taking a look at that in our vulnerability analysis discussion. And the first vulnerability we exploit is actually going to be an RPC endpoint vulnerability in Windows operating system. Remote procedure calls are listeners waiting to receive requests to perform remote processing. So that is just prime candidate for exploitation. And a lot of times they're insecure, a lot of times they're not unencrypted. So you want to protect RPC endpoints. All right, so in the lab, you're going to be using a utility called RPC scan and super enum to enumerate NFS shares on your Ubuntu box in your lab environment. But RPC scan communicates with RPC services, checks misconfigurations on the shares. Super enum does basic enumeration of any open port. So you'll see some very Nmap-ish types of results. And these scans can be fairly exhaustive and they can be pretty time consuming. So when you get into the lab, don't think your scan's not running if it consumes a considerable amount of time. Some of these scans take a long time to execute. All right, SMTP enumeration, simple mail transfer protocol, used for sending email. Listens on port 25 by default. There's also SSL TLS versions, 465, 995 for POP and so forth. We'll talk more about that when we get to our sniffers discussion. But SMTP has 3 built-in commands that can assist in identifying user accounts on the SMTP server. VRFY validates users. XPN shows the actual delivery addresses of aliases and mailing lists. And receipt 2 defines the recipients of a message. So any of these can be used to identify user accounts. The VRFY XPN receipt 2s are executed from a command line interface, which can be done with Telnet or a script. So just to show you one more Nmap script, all right, the default installation of Nmap has 599 scripts by default. If I go to the SMTP section, there's an SMTP enum users. If I edit that with Notepad++, right off the bat, it shows me it's using the XPN receipt and VRFYs. So this is just automatically establishing a command line dialog and executing XPN receipt and verifies. Now, we don't really have anything set up in the lab for that, but I can show you an emulation of, if I telnet into my victim system on port 25, I get a banner right off the bat, so we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. That's a telnet banner grabbing. If I do VRFY, Eric, not able to verify user, but we'll take a message for Eric add victim if they exist. So you would VRFY the username and either confirm or not confirm and say take message for. So that actually shows the telnet, and then netcat commands can also be used, which are basically functionally equivalent to telnet. All right, same thing if I netcat. And this one doesn't like the VRFY for some reason. It stalls out on me. So sometimes the netcat telnet stuff, they should work identically. Sometimes something doesn't fly in netcat. And that actually has been dependent on the version of the Linux OS. So this current Parrot box doesn't do it. Previously I ran it with Kali and it worked just fine. So sometimes the tools get a little bit temperamental. All right, so that's a little bit on SMTP enumeration. And then Nmap, of course, has a script for it. I just showed you that. And then Metasploit, which we haven't talked about yet. Metasploit is my go-to pen testing framework or toolkit. So typically it's Nmap for the scanning, an OpenVAS or a Nessus for vulnerability scanning, Metasploit for exploitation, Wireshark for protocol analysis, Burp Suite for web application analysis. Really, you could boil most everything in this course down to about 5 or 6 tools. And believe me, I will be pointing those out as we go along. All right, so Metasploit, that's a discussion for another time. All right, DNS information or enumeration using zone transfer. The DNS zone transfer, as I mentioned before, should be disallowed to untrusted hosts. However, doesn't mean best practices are always followed. So to request a zone transfer, you can either use DIG, Domain Internet Groper, NSLOOKUP, which is a classic traditional DNS enumeration interface tool, and then DNS Recon. And there's more than that. There's host and a bunch of others. DIG, which you're going to be running in the lab, is the kind of default command line utility in Linux. NSLOOKUP is both Linux and Microsoft. DNS Recon is, again, another script. And then you've got online tools for requesting zone transfers as well. So in the lab, you're going to be running through a couple different variations, the DIG command and NSLOOKUP. All right, and then DNS cache snooping. Okay, DNS servers will cache information that they've resolved for a client in the event that the same information is requested in a subordinate request or subsequent request by another client. So it holds it in cache, it kind of writes it down on Scratchpad. DNS cache snooping is an enumeration technique where the attacker can query the DNS server for a specific cache record. All right, the non-recursive method, you set a non-recursive query, set the recursion desired bit in the query set to 0. That means it won't go out and perform recursion. If you say non-recursive, it's give me what you've got, don't go out and look it up. Recursive, send a recursive query to determine the time the DNS record resides in the cache, and that can, a high TTL value indicates the record was not in the cache. So TTLs, or time to live, are actually set at the record level. Most other types of caches have a default TTL for cached entries. DNS is kind of the odd man out in the fact that the TTL is actually tied to the record itself. Now, later on, we're going to talk about cache poisoning. We're really not quite ready to go there yet, but there's DNS cache poisoning, there's ARP cache poisoning, there's internet cache poisoning, and you could do a NetBIOS name cache poisoning, although that's not a real mainstream thing. So we're going to visit cache poisoning as a really useful way to attack a system in the sniffers module, and again in the web application and session hijacking discussions. All right, DNSSEC zone walking. All right, you are not supposed to do this. All right, so imagine you've got a external, that's a horrible server. That's even worse. External DNS server that maintains a zone file, and an internal DNS server that also maintains a zone file. All right, these should be completely separated by a firewall. There should be no commingling of records between these two zone files. You got the external DNS, which is meant to be found by the outside world. You have the internal DNS, which should never, ever be exposed to the outside world because that's all your internal resources. So no commingling. DNS walking is trying to traverse obtaining internal records from the DNS server if the zone is not properly configured. All right, so they should be totally separate and no interaction between the two. Now you can set up things like split horizon, split DNS, where there are conditional attempts. The best way is 2 individual zone files, no talkie. They do not communicate. They do not share information. Otherwise, there's a possibility for misconfiguration, and you could pivot from one to the other. So LDNS and DNS Recon might exploit the vulnerability and obtain network information of a target and further launch internet-based attacks. All right, DNS and DNSSEC enumeration using Nmap. So it kind of goes without saying that Nmap has extensive scriptability. There's 599 scripts included in the default installation, and you can write your own. So if somebody ever asks you, can Nmap do that? Just go ahead and say yes and figure it out later, because either has a script for it or you can write one for it. It can brute force. It can do password cracking, which would be brute forcing, vulnerability analysis, tons of stuff. Monster powerful tool, and again, totally free, which you gotta love. All right, so DNS enumeration, there's, again, scripts for that, DNS service discovery. DNSSEC enumeration, okay, DNSSEC's a little bit different. In DNSSEC is a series of signed responses, which helps with the whole DNS spoofing and DNS poisoning issues. We're going to table the rest of that discussion for our sniffers module, where it makes more sense to talk about. But for now, note that there are 2 different types of servers, standard DNS and DNSSEC, and each one of them contain useful information to the attacker. So the DNSSEC enum NSE Nmap script can be used specifically for DNS servers to enumerate domains and subdomains. All right, and then IPsec enumeration. We're going to discuss IPsec in 3 separate locations in the course. So we're starting off with it in enumeration, since IPsec may actually indicate a VPN connection or VPN endpoint or VPN access point in the network. VPNs are automatically interesting because they are an access port into the network from the outside world. IPsec runs in 2 modes. You have tunnel mode, you have transport mode, and then you have AH, authentication header, and encapsulating security payload. The negotiation of an IPsec connection requires some ground rules. 2 systems want to communicate, they start having a dialogue, and they negotiate tunnel mode, transport mode, AH, ESP, what algorithms, what authentication mechanism, and there's a multi-phase handshake that takes place. We'll talk more about quick mode and main mode and security associations when we get into the session hijacking module. But for now, that handshake negotiates the parameters of the connection, and utilities like IkeScan can actually complete that handshake and enumerates the requirements for the connection, requirements for the box. So this runs actually on port UDP 500. UDP 500 is the Internet Key Exchange, which includes the Internet Security and Key Management Protocol, which includes the Oakley protocol, which uses the Diffie-Hellman algorithm to do the key agreement and negotiation. So you hear these different terms all kind of thrown around with establishing an IPsec connection, and they're all part of the same process. So they're used sometimes interchangeably, but they're all different phases of the same process. We're going to talk more about that when we get to session hijacking, but we are definitely interested in UDP 500 listeners, since they may be a way to VPN into the network. All right, VoIP enumeration. VoIP's session initiation protocol enables voice and video calls over an IP network. So those might be exposed to the outside world as well. And that leads to things like exploiting VoIP gateway servers, IPPX systems, leads to denial of service, caller ID spoofing, eavesdropping, VoIP phishing, etc. And VoIP communications by default are not encrypted. You can actually capture a VoIP phone call with Wireshark or Kane or a variety of other utilities and play them back as an MP3 file. So if they're using real-time transport protocol versus secure real-time, you can also intercept and eavesdrop on the phone calls. Pretty cool. Our remote procedure call enumeration, or RPCs, are listeners dedicated for facilitating remote procedure call requests. We talked about that a little bit earlier, and they are just prime targets for exploiting systems. And there have been plenty of RPC vulnerabilities over the years. In our vulnerability analysis module, I'm going to run a vulnerability scan, and we're going to take a look at one of the classic Microsoft vulnerabilities, which is an unsecured RPC endpoint. We're going to use that to perform a buffer overflow attack. The buffer overflow is going to get system level access, and it's all based on an unsecured, unprotected RPC endpoint. So again, these can be scanned like anything else, NetScan Tools Pro, and then Nmap. So again, if Nmap can do it, why bother with anything else? In Unix and Linux environments, there are system commands for enumerating user accounts like rusers, rwho, and finger. Finger is a little bit dated. That goes back to like University of Minnesota, the Gophers protocol back in the early days of Unix, Linux environments. Finger runs on port 79. It displays information about system users, who's logged on. You're kind of like, who are you logged on? That's the way I always think of Finger. rwho displays a list of users logged on to hosts in the network, and rusers displays a list of users logged on to remote machines or machines local network. So this is like the PS logged on, more or less, which shows you who's logged on to the remote system. All right, Telnet and SMB enumeration. Telnet is, if you see a Telnet listener, it's either a honeypot or it's an IoT device. So Telnet runs over TCP port 23. It's horribly insecure in the grand scheme of things. Telnet data, passwords, and usernames are all sent in clear text, easy to hijack, and shouldn't be used for remote administration. So when you're scanning for a port 23 listener, looking for a Telnet port, you can also Telnet into other Telnet compliant services. I just showed you an example of Telnetting into the SMTP server to do a VRFY for the ERIC user account. Server message block enumeration, we mentioned earlier, is a 449, 445, or 139 port. And SMB has had more than its share of vulnerabilities over the years. All right, specifically earlier versions, SMB version 1 and so forth, but there have been lots of attacks leveraged on 139 or 445 since those are primary Microsoft communication endpoints. All right, FTP enumeration is kind of an oddball. FTP has a control port of 21 and a data port of 20. At least for standard FTP, there's active and passive, there's verse connections, there's port incrementation, but primarily FTP, 21 to establish the connection and 20 to do the data transfer. So it requires opening a port, a range of ports for the typical FTP. So there might be a reverse connecting FTP that does an incrementation of ports. Regardless, it's the port 21 listener we're looking for. You find port 21, that's the control port that's used to establish and negotiate the connection. You can use Nmap for it like anything else. And then TFTP runs on UDP port 69. TFTP is not going to require any authentication whatsoever. It's used to transfer configuration files to Cisco routers and that sort of thing. And it's pretty insecure due to the fact there's no authentication. So these are also clear text by default. You should be using some sort of encryption on any clear text protocol. So we have the SSH suite and secure copy protocol. You can also run FTP under SSL or TLS. But again, we'll have the full encryption discussion when we get to our sniffers module in module 8. All right. And that's what we have slated to talk about in enumeration. So lots of different types of enumeration, lots of different tools potentially, or you could use Nmap, which does most of it in one interface. But it's also more active than scanning, and it is part of the pre-attack phase. We're still in information gathering, although it's not scanning proper. It's part of that scanning, that scanning genre, if you will, which is prior to gaining access. All right, we've got lots of cool labs for this module, and our next module we're going to cover is going to be vulnerability analysis. So that's it for module 4, enumeration.